The end of humanity is a gruesome thought. For 14 days in October, this end was a very scary possibility in what was later to be called the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the end of World War II, a new conflict arose that was the Cold War between the United States and the Union of Socialist Republics. The US and USSR were fighting in a war of ideologies, the US on the side of democracy and the USSR on the side of communism. This conflict spanned several decades, created many clashes in places like Berlin, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Cuba, and was plagued with a nuclear threat which is growing to be much worse than what had happened in Japan. However, it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis that this nuclear threat reached its zenith. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the result of the disputed rights of Cuba. Castro, in his idea of the right to a sovereign Cuba, caused a conflict between the responsibilities of Kennedy of the US and Khrushchev of the USSR. This was due to their conflicting perceptions of Cuba and their own role in its affairs. Cuba had always been striving for the right to be independent, but the US wanted Cuba to remain under its sphere of influence. In response, Castro looked to Khrushchev to help guarantee Cuba's freedom. Khrushchev took responsibility of protecting Cuba and saw it as a foothold into the Western Hemisphere, where he could gain a strategic advantage over the US. This conflict would then erupt into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba has had an interesting history with the US. The island nation began as a colony of Spain, but was liberated with the help of the US in 1898 and given full independence in 1902. The Platt Amendment, however, ensured that the US would always have a say in the matters and ongoings of Cuba. Cuba entered an era of prosperity, but with a massive wealth gap. US-Cuban relations were great during this time, and in 1934, the American-Cuban Treaty of Relations repealed the Platt Amendment, giving more freedom to Cuba, lessened the responsibility of the US, and was a show of good relations between the two countries. This all changed when Fidel Castro rose to power and took over Cuba. Relations between the countries fell, and Cuba looked to the Soviets and its ideas of communism for Cuba's future. Cuban sovereignty was an idea born out of the Cuba Libre movement of the Spanish-American War. The Cubans fought for the right to autonomy without Spanish rule, only to be governed by another imperial power, the US. The US governed Cuba's trade, foreign policy, and economics for several years under Fulgencio Batista's pro-American government. Fidel Castro was strongly influenced by Marxist writings and found Batista's capitalist pro-American government corrupt. With the help of guerrilla leader Che Guevara, Castro led the 26th of July movement to overthrow Batista during the Cuban Revolution in an attempt to rid Cuba of US imperialism and attain the right to Cuban sovereignty. Castro hated how the Batista government was so corrupt and blamed the US for supporting it. He saw his revolution as a liberation from the cruelest exploitation of the world by imperialism. After Castro's rise to power, he nationalized foreign-owned properties, especially those of the US, in Cuba. Castro's regime became the United Party of the Cuban Socialist Revolution. The relations between the US and Cuba deteriorated very fast. The US responded by restricting trade in the eventual embargo of Cuba in 1960. The US did not approve of Cuba becoming a foothold for the Soviets to enter into the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was less than 100 miles off the shores of the US and was surrounded by other Caribbean and South American nations. Domino theory stated that when a political event happens in one country, similar events will happen in neighboring countries. During the Cold War, this theory represented the spread of communism, and while the US was afraid it would spread all over Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary stated that countries in Latin America were under the US sphere of influence. The US's plan of containment dictated that for communism to be stopped, the US must be responsible for halting its expansion at all fronts, and Cuba was a tragic failure in terms of upholding this responsibility. The main reasons why the US was so against Castro's government was because it was communist and anti-American. The US had traditionally been an imperial power over Cuba ever since its liberation from Spain. Although America guaranteed that Cuba would not become part of the US empire in the Teller Amendment, the Platt Amendment took a step back and allowed the US to have much more control in the ongoings of Cuba. This relationship lasted until Castro's uprising. When Castro came to power, the US suddenly lost all its influence over Cuba, which the US considered part of its sphere of influence. However, the US did not suddenly drop its responsibilities as a power on the island with the rise of Castro. The US embargoed Cuba and then conducted the Bay of Pigs invasion and later Operation Mongoose in an attempt to overthrow Castro. All this sent a message to Khrushchev that the US did not approve of Castro and was hard at work to get rid of him. Castro felt threatened by the US and looked to its ally, the USSR, for help. In the Cold War, the USSR was fighting a losing battle, for the US had superior power, resources, and nuclear capabilities. Khrushchev knew this and needed a way to even the playing fields. This opportunity came in the form of Cuba. Historically, the Soviet Union was the motherland of communism. The goal of Soviet leaders was to spread communism and end the class rule Karl Marx had stated in the Communist Manifesto. Vladimir Lenin, the premier of the Soviet Union, advocated that the USSR focus on the spread of Marxist ideas to other states around the world. The Communist International, or Comintern, was established by Lenin to support communist governments worldwide. During the Cold War, the US was challenging communism wherever it popped up in its policy of containment. This involved an arms race where being more technologically advanced and using strong military equipment would give an edge in any confrontations. The USSR was constantly under the threat of nuclear missiles. There were 15 Jupiter missiles in Turkey, 30 missiles in Italy, 60 Thor missiles in Britain, and over 200 ICBMs that had the capability to strike the USSR. Fidel Castro came to the USSR in search of an ally after its income was being shattered by the US embargo. Castro needed someone to back up Cuban sovereignty against the US, while Khrushchev needed an advantage in the Cold War. To counter the embargo, Khrushchev and Castro made a trade agreement that was Cuban sugar for Soviet oil. Cuba started to become more dependent on the Soviet markets and military aid. This eventually led them to become allies with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would also protect Cuba from US invasion. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro announced that Cuba was a socialist republic. In the months leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, each side had its own goals. Castro wanted Cuba to maintain its right to be free of imperial rule in a new communist government. Khrushchev wanted to gain a foothold into the Western Hemisphere to put pressure on the US and defend its new ally, Cuba. Kennedy did not want a communist foothold in the US sphere of influence and sought to overthrow Castro. In order to both defend Cuban rights and uphold Soviet responsibility, Khrushchev decided to arrange Operation Anadir. This operation was a secret Soviet mission to establish a military presence in Cuba that involved ballistic missiles, medium-range bombers, and Soviet troops ready to repel US invasion. Castro and Khrushchev both agreed this plan would fulfill both their interests. This operation went forward on June 17, 1962. Soviet freighters full of supplies left the Black Sea for Cuba. Throughout the voyage, the US kept aerial reconnaissance over the boats. It was not until October 14th that US U-2 reconnaissance planes spotted the deployment of nuclear missiles on the island. Being informed of this information, Kennedy assembled a meeting with his peers, which would later become XCOM. During this meeting, Kennedy discussed that the Soviet missiles installed in Cuba would undermine the U.S. responsibility of maintaining the sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Having missiles in Cuba gave the Soviets quick nuclear strike capabilities throughout the continental U.S., including Washington, D.C. This put American citizens under the gun of nuclear missiles. Americans were not used to this feeling of enemies at the gates that Europeans were used to, a feeling the Soviets felt about the U.S. missiles in Turkey. The missiles also gave Khrushchev immense bargaining power in any negotiations. Kennedy's advisors advocated for an invasion of Cuba, not wanting to risk nuclear warfare. Kennedy decided on a blockade of Cuba to prevent more missiles from entering Cuba. Kennedy cleverly called the blockade a quarantine in his national address to the nation on October 22nd, since a blockade was considered an act of war. This began the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev saw the U.S. blockade as an infringement on the rights of Cuba. In his letters to Kennedy, he claimed that Cuba had the right to defend themselves and do as it pleased with its ally, the Soviet Union. Before Castro's rise to power in 1933, the Montevideo Convention was held, which defined what a sovereign state was and what rights it possessed. Each nation had the capacity to enter in its own relations with other states, and no state had the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. The Convention of Rights of Duties of States was signed by multiple countries of the International Conference of American States, including the U.S. and Cuba. If the Soviets were to send more missiles to Cuba, then Kennedy would see it as a threat and be forced to uphold his responsibility to protect the U.S. from foreign threats stated in the U.S. Constitution. On the other hand, Khrushchev viewed sending missiles to Cuba as no more of a threat than the Jupiter missiles already in place in Turkey, surrounding the USSR. He also thought he was justified in upholding his responsibilities as ally of Cuba. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were negotiating during the crisis, both sides' military were squaring off in a peculiar duel, waiting for the other to shoot first or in order to enter nuclear war. A US U-2 plane was shot down, a Soviet submarine was almost fired a nuclear torpedo, and the US blockade was being challenged by the Soviet Navy. The US went to DEFCON 2, the lowest in history, which meant that armed forces were ready to deploy and engage in less than 6 hours, and bombers were ready to strike in 15 minutes. This was the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war. Meanwhile, Castro wanted to no longer be the lesser nation below an imperial power in his quest for true Cuban rights. He thought Cuba could be equal partners in their relationship with the Soviets. However, this was not the case. With time of the essence, through several letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, a compromise was made in which the Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba publicly, while the U.S. secretly removed missiles from Turkey. Cuba was also guaranteed independence by the U.S., for they swore to no longer invade Cuba. Castro was never consulted in these negotiations, however. Although the threat of the U.S. taking away the right to Cuban sovereignty dissipated, Castro felt like Cuba was used, and its views didn't matter. Khrushchev felt he had fulfilled his responsibilities. He protected Cuba and allowed for it to remain a communist foothold, while also relieving the threat of missiles in the homeland. Kennedy had removed the threat of missiles from Cuba, fulfilling his responsibility to defend the U.S. from foreign threats. However, Cuba would now remain a free sovereign state and the U.S. would be unable to overthrow Castro, failing the responsibility to maintain the U.S. sphere of influence. Castro, feeling betrayed by not being involved in negotiations, let Cuban-Soviet relations deteriorate. Khrushchev, who appeared to the world as a loser in the confrontation against Kennedy, was shunned by his peers and eventually removed from office, and the USSR lost much prestige. Kennedy was seen as the hero that saved the US, but was criticized for allowing Cuba to remain free. In the end, both sides won. Because there was no hellfire raining from the sky, buildings weren't vaporized to dust, and millions of people didn't perish. Both sides valued a right and responsibility that was much more important than any that had come before. The right to life, and the responsibility of leaders of the world to protect this right from something like nuclear devastation. On the morning of October 29, when the crisis ended, people on every side of the conflict had their lives. That is why we have our lives today and can look back on these events as history.